All right, 5-second warning.
Good evening and well, good morning, everybody, depending what side of the globe you are following us. My name is Paul Neal, and it's an honor to welcome you all to the Monday evening lecture at the Explorers Club. I'm very proud to basically share with you our Project Avenger, an adventure that has been in the making for over 10 years. And over the next 45 minutes to an hour or so, you will hear more about this unique adventure that came together. Very briefly, as I said, my name is Paul Neal. I'm an Explorers Club member. I was a founding member of the Hong Kong chapter. Hong Kong, also the place where this happened. And now I'm based in Portugal, where I'm working and helping building out the local chapter. I'm an expedition leader, and I was also the project lead on this project. But as you will hear, this unique expedition had so many different angles that it would not have been possible without the extremely unique team, of which we have quite a wide range of members today on the presentation. Now, Project Avenger sheds light on a largely forgotten chapter of World War II, sort of a part of history that I also started sort of to learn and dig into while this expedition came together. But I wasn't aware when we started this process how much the historical events would cross path also with geopolitical events, whether this is tensions between China and the United States. I mean, what we are looking here into is excavating a US Navy airplane on Hong Kong soil. The fact how democracy protests and obviously COVID threw additional spanners into the engine and preparation of this project, in addition, obviously, to all the other problems that usually come along with putting an expedition together, whether this is bureaucracy or raising enough finance. Now, I mentioned already the team. The team was the truly unique, outstanding part of this project, and we have 4 further members of the expedition here today, which will run through that. So let me give you just a quick introduction of how we're gonna dive into the topic. On the presentation, we'll have first Dr. Chi-Man Kwong, who basically will share with us the historical background of World War II in East Asia, and in particular, the situation in Hong Kong, and sort of put the whole historical background together to set the scene basically for the unique discovery that was made now over 10 years ago by Craig Mitchell, who basically started and instigated the whole Project Avenger, and he will share with us how he basically started from a find in the jungle to basically dig deeper into this chapter. We then getting more into the expedition phase with Adam Janikowski to basically share with us what the unique partnerships were that we had to put together, and the novel approach that we have to find to essentially go there and lift the mystery of the airplane. And last but not least, Dr. Michael Rivera will go into the archaeological field work and the dig and basically the results that came from this. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Chi-Man to basically give us the historical background of what we're talking here in Project Avenger.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. And I'm Kwong Chi-Man from Hong Kong Baptist University. And as Paul said, I'm going to give you guys a very, very short historical background overview of the Project Avenger and Hong Kong during the Second World War. So Hong Kong was a British colony back then in 1941 when the Pacific War started. But even before the war started, Hong Kong already played a role in the war in East Asia, since Japan and China was already at war from 1937. So Hong Kong was one of the major shipping bays and one of the major places where China could import any strategic material from the outside world, in particular the United States and Britain, to fight its war against Japan for already more than 3 years already when the Pacific War started. But in December 1941, Japan attacked the British and American colonies, and of course the Dutch colonies in Asia as well. Hong Kong was one of the major targets. So after 18 days of fighting, the colony fell, and it was under the Japanese occupation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So under the Japanese occupation, the Japanese authority made many crucial decisions to try to turn Hong Kong into a strategic asset under the Japanese control. So, for example, it interned all the Europeans in several places on Hong Kong Island, and interned the prisoners of war in many places in Kowloon, and it started to try to control the strategic industries in Hong Kong as well. So at that time, Hong Kong was not just a shipping base, but also famous for its heavy and light industries. For example, the shipbuilding industries and all sorts of light industries on the Kowloon side. So basically, Hong Kong was quite important in terms of logistics in the South China and the South China Sea area for the Japanese. But on the other hand, the Americans started to attack Hong Kong from mainland China because it deployed an air force, the 14th Air Force in China from 1942. So more and more air attack against Hong Kong was launched from 1942 onwards, and it reached its peak in around 1944. So many of the places in Hong Kong were bombed by the US Army Air Force heavy bombers. For example, in the picture on the right, you see the American bombers were bombing the Hong Kong shipyard in October 1944 as one of the preparatory attack against the Philippines. So one of the preliminary moves against the Philippines by the American forces. So Hong Kong was almost constantly under American air attack during the Pacific War from, say, 1942 all the way until almost the end of the war. But most of these attacks were launched by the US Army Air Force units, particularly the US Army Air Force in mainland China, the 14th Air Force. So next slide, please. But on the other hand, of course, the US Navy was also pushing towards Japan and the western part of the Pacific from the east, and you started to witness increased American naval activities in the western Pacific from mid-1944 onwards, especially after the Battle of Marianas. So in October 1944, the US fleet first encroached the Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the Hainan area and launched a very large air attack against Taiwan. And then you have the Battle of Leyte Island, where basically the Americans had gained full control of the western part of the Pacific. So when the Japanese main fleet was reduced to more like a symbolic presence, and in early 1945, the US Navy launched another major incursion in South China Sea, and including and launched attacks against various Japanese shipping positions, including in Indochina, in Hainan Island, in Taiwan, and of course in Hong Kong. So on 15th of January 1945, the Americans launched the first aerial superiority attack against Hong Kong. So fighter planes were launched from US carriers to attack the Kai Tak Air Base in Hong Kong in order to gain the control of the airspace over Hong Kong. And then on the next day, on the 16th of January 1945, the Americans launched another 430-something sorties against Hong Kong. So from 10 aircraft carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 3 light aircraft carriers. So on that day, basically Hong Kong was bombed throughout the day by hundreds of US Navy bombers from 10 aircraft carriers and from different directions. So that day, when we read about the local accounts from the prisoners of war diaries, or from the local residents, or even from young students who witnessed the battle, it was really a grand sight, just like in this particular photo, when the US Navy bombers were attacking Japanese shippings in Victoria Harbor. This is the space of Shangwan and Sai Ying Pun area. So basically just right next to central area. So nowadays it was all built up. So the air attack lasted for whole days from around 9 a.m. all the way to around 5 p.m. So hundreds of aircrafts were involved. And at that time, particularly, there was a Japanese convoy staying in Victoria Harbor to take shelters from potential American air attacks. So you can see also in this picture, it's full of Japanese oil tankers. So oil tankers were precious Japanese strategic assets at that time, but particularly at that time of the war, because there is not many of them left. So all these ships were bombed. They were heavily damaged. Some of them were sunk. So basically the convoy was destroyed. But the Americans also suffered some losses because the attack was, from their after action report, the attack was not very well coordinated. Hundreds of aircrafts packed into a rather narrow airspace. So there were, and you also witnessed heavy Japanese anti-aircraft fire because they were basically packed together. Then Victoria Harbor was quite kind of strange area where two sides were hills. So the planes were forced into a pretty narrow airspace to conduct their attack. So at the end of the day, the Americans lost 17 aircraft over Hong Kong in the attack. So from the after action report of the Third Fleet, it was not a particularly fruitful attack. It was conducted in very large scale. The site was grand, but the attack was not particularly successful, especially with the heavy losses involved. But anyway, but from the Japanese side, it was still devastating because the Japanese convoy was destroyed. Hong Kong was no longer could be used as a shipping base for the Japanese forces. And basically, after the raid in January 1945, the Japanese forces in South China decided to really narrow down their perimeter of defenses and only try to keep Hong Kong Island and the area near Canton and prepare for an Allied assault. But of course, the Allied forces did not and shifted their main drive towards Okinawa and Iwo Jima and then towards the mainland Japan. So basically, that's the historical context of the whole Avenger project. So the next would be for Craig, who will talk about the finding of the aircraft on the hills.
Thank you, Dr. Chi-Man. Can I just say what an honor and privilege it is to be here talking to such a prestigious group. I never had a thought that 10 years ago, when I was first traipsing around the hills, that this would lead to such a huge experience, and to be here right now in front of you. So try and put you in the picture it was. I was actually up in the hills looking for something completely different. As you heard earlier on there, Chi-Man was saying that the Battle of Hong Kong really, the Second World War in Asia really kicked off sort of in December 41. Hours within Pearl Harbor, the attacks on Singapore, Malaya, it all happened simultaneously, Philippines. So I was actually looking for evidence in Hong Kong of the Battle for Hong Kong, which was December 41. And I'd recently got given a battle map from a friend, and it showed all of the lines of advance from the Japanese. It showed where there were pitched battles, and it was very clearly marked with a good key that showed you exactly what bits of equipment and guns and stuff were used throughout the battle at various phases. So I'd actually just got this map fairly recently from a friend. And what I did notice that up on a hill, in fact, the hill right behind Paul there, if you can actually sort of see the background from Paul there, that is actually the site that we were working on. And on the battle map that I looked at, it clearly showed a very important Japanese gun position in the final hours of the Battle for Hong Kong, just before capitulation on Christmas Day, 1941. The Japanese were shelling the southern side of Hong Kong quite heavily. And the battle map clearly showed way up on the hill there that it's not marked on any trails. There's no hiking trails or anything around there. But the Japanese had a big presence up there. And these keys generally tell you there's around about 100, 120 people manning these kind of gun pits and stuff. So it was a significant lump up on the hill. And that's what I was actually trying to look up there for. And I was wandering around and getting nowhere. But just as I was about to turn around and sort of give up for the day, I happened to look underneath the tree, and underneath the tree was a substantial piece of metal. I mean, it was a bit of heavy steel iron, and then you could also see what looked to be very, very weathered aluminium. It kind of gets very sort of brittle, and it gets very powdery after many years. But I could tell straight away that this was a significant find. I mean, we're way, way top on the hill. I mean, unless it came from a tractor or a steamship, I didn't know how else it could have got up there. So I was unprepared for it at that day. I was only traveling light. I was only on a recce trip just then. So I wasn't prepared to be able to recover it just then. So I GPSed it, put a few flags up and stuff. And the following day, I actually came back up more prepared with a heavy bag and some padding and stuff like that. So I could then recover it. Once I got at home, I could actually start to clean it up, and things started to get a little bit exciting there, because what I could tell was where the cast steel was mated or joined to the aluminium, you could see very clear bolts, very heavy bolts all the way around. This is a very solid piece of metal. And upon cleaning and inspection, there were bolts actually started to come up with little numbers and names and serial numbers and stuff. So very quickly, it became apparent on Google, through Google search engines and stuff, that these particular bolts were US Second World War era. So they didn't use them until after. So they used them between 1942 and sort of like 1945, I think they were. But they were very specific, close tolerance aviation bolts. So these were from an airplane. So this was a significant piece of aircraft to know that it probably just didn't get hit and sort of, wounded and it flew on. It must have come down fairly close. It was a big chunk of aircraft. So we then needed to go and find a little bit more of this. I say we, it was me and my friend, maybe, and a dog. So there was 2 or 3 of us, and we had our initial place to try and find. And we were searching for about 2 months. We were just doing your typical spiral search. What we did was we guide a sector off, and we tried to do one big quadrant on one day, and we would start and we would just do a big 2-meter spiral search, 2 meter, just going out and out and out. And we were getting nowhere. We were doing this for about 2.5 months. The initial find was actually in January 2012. And by the end of March 2012, we'd already been up there a dozen times or so, and we were finding not a lot else. And yeah, it was starting to, enthusiasm was starting to wane. So we were getting a little bit more anxious. So we tried a different area. We decided we were going to look for a completely different area. Let's just break away from something different. And it was lucky that we did, because soon after, almost like on 100 meters away from where we've been normally searching, we started finding a few little tiny fragments, but that was enough to give us some optimism. And over the next day or two, we went back up there the following day as well. It was a Saturday, Sunday, because now we started to get a bit more items there. We thought that we might get a bit luck. And I think the main time that we thought we had something really important was about a week or two later, where we actually found a 50 caliber machine gun bullet, but this had been blown off. And if you're unfamiliar with this kind of stuff there, if you have a live round, a bullet of any description, if you throw it into a fire, it will explode, but the shell is left all completely ruined and all ripped apart and stuff. And it's a very clear evidence that has been part of a fire or a plane crash. So we started finding these. We started finding a couple of 50 cal machine guns, which all looked completely ripped up. So we knew that we were close by. So we kept searching and searching. And eventually we found another spot close by, which gave us some bigger pits. So we kind of knew that we were in the right area. The main aha moment was then when I was like using aerial photographs. I know that aerial photographs can be very useful if you know what to look for and if you can try and find any kind of scars in the ground. And that's what I did. So I got an aerial photograph from 1949. And I superimposed that onto an area that I'd been searching. And very close to where I had been searching, there was a big clear scar on the ground. And I knew that that was something of importance. So we then set about to try to find that. And I literally put that GPS location into my watch. And I went up there and I was searching, and I actually fell into the spot that you can see up there on the screen there. And it's a little bit hard to tell there, but I mean, right down over here, we've got some massive, great big chunks of machinery. We've got this is all part of the propeller hub. There's also the landing gears as well that are just out of sight. But all of this here was just literally just lying around in the floor, about maybe 50, 80 yards away from where I initially was starting to find. So we knew that we'd found this location. But what was interesting is that whilst we were getting closer and closer and getting these searching, one of my other friends was also a local historian, and he'd actually been doing a lot of research on the local civilian POW camp, which is just down the road, which happens to be where the Japanese were fighting the last stand. So where the civilian POWs was exactly the last place where the Battle of Hong Kong was taking place. And he happened to tell me, he's like, I've got a number of POW accounts here that sort of said they saw a plane crash in this area, and they all kind of tie in pretty quite tightly together. So he very kindly sent me the accounts, and there are at least 4 prisoner POW accounts from British and American prisoners of war that all have exactly the same consistent account. And they said on January the 16th, at about 12:30, 1 o'clock, the lunchtime raid they referred it to, they said a massive wave of a seaborne aircraft came, and just as they were flying overhead of the POWs, the Japanese were putting up so much anti-aircraft fire that 2 of them actually just collided. I mean, they were getting bounced around by the reverberation and the explosions, the percussions of all the anti-aircraft, that 2 of them unfortunately collided and they came down. And looking at the account of what they were saying, and then having a look at the site that what he had, that was what really gave us a really massive big boost, because one of the first things I also found that day there, apart from seeing a few of the propeller hubs there, was a little bit further down the hill was an arrestor hook, which, if you're familiar with sort of naval or aviation operations, an arrestor hook is what an airplane uses to catch on the back of an aircraft carrier. So it is only a warbird that uses it. It's not a civilian thing. And to find that in amongst what we were looking at right now basically confirmed beyond doubt that whatever plane we had, it was a Navy plane, and it was lost on January the 16th. But having found all of this stuff there, and no matter how enthusiastic and energetic I was about finding it, I knew that this was a scale beyond me. I mean, I'm not a professional enough, and I would have butchered the job, and I would not have done it the courtesy and the respect that it needed. So I needed to try to find some partnership, and this is where it took a little bit of time to try to find the right people, and just through word of mouth. And Hong Kong's a very small community with these kind of historic kind of things, and I think it took about 3 years, I think maybe 4 years before I actually joined up with Paul. Paul managed to get introduced to me from a third-party friend of ours, and he came to me and started to ask me about the airplane. And before we knew it, we kind of made up a pretty good team, and it started to gather pace there. But without Paul and the help of the Explorers Club, I mean, I would have still been dallying myself around. So this has all really been put down to Paul and his and the rest of the team there with their effort with trying to fund it and trying to find the right people. So I cannot thank the rest of the guys enough for really putting this together and turning this into a once in a lifetime memorable exercise. So thank you very much for everybody else there. So I think I'll leave Paul to try and tell you a little bit about what the actual goals of the expedition were, now that I've given you guys a little bit more context of the actual crash site and how that was discovered.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Craig. And so I was connected with Craig. I actually was at that stage researching on behalf of the Hong Kong chapter of the Explorers Club the potential to do some more localized expeditions, something that more digs into the history. I had my head focused on something underwater, but when I heard the story of a find of an aircraft in the jungle, I was obviously fascinated, and Craig and I really connected very well. And what we basically very quickly came to the conclusion is this is a very unique find, in particular about a chapter of history that is not very well known. I mean, Dr. Chiman basically shared the historical context, but I was actually not aware that there were bombing raids on Hong Kong in World War II. There were actually there's museums in Hong Kong that basically obviously talk about the story of World War II, the Battle of Hong Kong, and what happened afterwards. But basically, the fact that there was actually Allied bombing raids and what happened during the war was basically a chapter that was nowhere, a chapter of history that was nowhere acknowledged. So very quickly, we came to the conclusion: we want to have a proper scientific examination of that airplane wreck, and with that, a proper identification of the story, and ideally move that also into a conservation aspect to bring this story to a broader audience. And that obviously was the first goal that our mission basically accomplished. The second one was a little bit driven from the chapter that what we wanted to do at that time. The idea is, here is a unique find in Hong Kong. It's in the jungle. It's reasonably, I mean, it's an effort to get there. Probably for most of the viewers today, Hong Kong is associated with skyscraper and urban city, like a massive dense city. That's correct, but that's obviously only correct for about 30–40% of the territory. The majority actually of is protected land, and that bush and jungle growth is extremely dense. And exactly in one of those jungles, this plane went down. You're probably only aerial distance less than, I don't know, 6 or 7 kilometers from the central business district. But it takes an hour and a half hacking through the jungle to actually get to the crash site that Craig detected with or found with so much effort. So what we wanted to use is the proximity of this expedition or this goal, this scientific discovery, to the urban environment as a potential factor to also include the broader public, and with that obviously make advertising for the future next generation of explorers. From a chapter perspective, we say from an explorers club, why don't we make it in a way where we, yes, bring experts, do it really scientifically, but also partner with to bring in the general public. And that became basically our second goal. And the third goal was driven by more necessity, which basically came around a novel approach that we had to formulate in regards to the way we approach the fieldwork. Adam will share a little bit more about the complicated approval process that was required in order to look at it or even touch a US Navy aircraft and that compounded US Navy aircraft on Hong Kong soil. I alluded in my introduction that we struggled with obviously some of the consequences of events that happened over the last few years. When Craig and I met the first time, we said this is gonna be, we bring some experts in, we will find archaeologists and aviation archaeologists. There's experts in the United States that will come and will participate and will help us identify the plane. Everything was scheduled for autumn of 2019. In obviously the second half of 2019 saw the demonstrations and a very difficult political situation in Hong Kong. The US NGO, which we partnered, found it at that time too dangerous to basically send somebody to Hong Kong. The whole project was postponed for 6 months, and then we all know what happened in March 2020. And Hong Kong, still is a very hard place to get to with quarantine restrictions and very lengthy quarantine. So we had to invent a novel approach. And that basically were the 3 goals that we set ourselves: raise the public awareness of the project, identify what this is, the plane, come to a scientific conclusion, what exactly, who was the crew, what's the number, what basically is the background story of this, include the general public, and create a novel way of basically examining the aircraft. And I think Adam can share now more how we basically solve these points.
So thank you very much, Paul. I really appreciate that. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen to our project summary. It's a real honor. I'm a member of Club. It's a real honor to be able to present to our fellow explorers. So, this is a great time to talk about the team. The Project Avenger team is very diverse, and that's one of our goals, but in terms of nationality, residency, and expertise. So I'll quickly run through everyone and their background, the role they played. But I think when you want to remember about Project Avenger and how we pulled it off is, what a lot of international expeditions and explorations will look like going forward is diversity in all aspects. And I know that's important to the club, but for something like this in Hong Kong with the US naval plane, it was absolutely important. Everybody brought something really interesting to the table. So up on the left, you've already met Paul. hugely accomplished explorer, members of the founder of the Explorers Club out here. I think 3 or 4 flag expeditions under his belt, and all of the 7 summits under his belt. And that's actually how we met. As I mentioned, I'm a member of the club here. When Paul was looking for people to help with the expedition, I put my hand up and got onto what is my second flag expedition. Top right, they're the real instigators of the story. You already heard from Craig, his friend Lee. They're local historians, adventurers, and avid metal detectorists. And then Chi-Man, whose photo is actually missing, is a crucially important part of the team, and not only in providing the historical context, which you heard already, but also he directed us to our initial funding. And I think as explorers and expeditionists, we all know how important it is to get funding. So with our initial funding in place, as Paul mentioned, we had actually intended to engage some professional aviation archaeologists, which some of you may know is a very, very steep day rate. But the Hong Kong protests, the COVID restrictions made that basically an impracticality. And so, as luck would have it, from a bit of hard work, we found Dr. Michael Rivera, up in the top kind of middle right, freshly back to Hong Kong from completing his PhD in Cambridge. He was willing to join the expedition, but here's the kicker: his expertise is actually forensic, anthropological archaeology, not aviation archaeology. So this was a really key issue that we had to overcome. And I think that's where Paul alluded to being able to find experts and what we would, what we're calling telearchaeology. We were able to source 2 experts, Dr. Andrew Petrushka, as well as Dr. William Belcher, both located in the US, that could overlook our work from an aviation military history point of view. So Michael brought the technical side of archaeology as the lead archaeologist, and then we had the expertise. And working together this way was actually fascinating. And I really do think with all the modern, the fact that we're talking globally right now, this is going to be some of the new face of exploration. So to literally make sure we left no stone uncovered, we brought in some remote sensing experts from Hong Kong Polytechnic University, down in the bottom right, Dr. Wallace Lai and Sahib Sandhu. And then by this time, the project was getting rather large, as you can imagine, because we're looking at bringing in volunteers. We have a large kind of leadership team. Winsome Lee, a trained archaeologist, joined us as operations manager. And then also, I think for expeditions going forward is extremely important. Phoebe Lee stepped in to manage our incredible social media feed. It's gone a little dark as we haven't been as active lately now that the fieldwork's done, but you guys should all check it out. It is a really well managed feed. We're very, very proud of what we've done. So I guess what I'm trying to say here with this slide is that although we were constrained by circumstances like COVID, funding, as Paul mentioned, the Hong Kong protests, which most of you saw in the news, at the end of the day, we're able to field an incredibly strong team from 4 universities in Hong Kong, supported by universities and expertise outside of Hong Kong, American University, for example. This team has expertise across history, remote sensing, exploration, technology. Everybody really brought something to the table. It was really amazing to see how this team worked. And I think this is the way a multifaceted expedition should be. I would hold this up as a poster child for what I'm going to call the new expeditions, the new archaeology, the blending of field work, the blending of exploration, background. All of this was really interesting and couldn't have been done without such a diverse team. Next slide. Oh, too far. We may be off. Anyways, so what I was going to say is in terms of preparation, we'll get to this airlift in a minute. The preparation took over a year, but it really came on from 10 years ago when Craig first found the plane. Obviously, everything runs on money. We had some incredible sponsors on the slide that I'm seeing. We've actually listed them here, but I'll just mention them really quickly. Some were financial, like the American Club here in Hong Kong. Some were in kind, like Garrett, the metal detectors. You may see Garrett when you go through an airport, for those of you who are still now traveling. They provided us all of our metal detectors, which were so crucial. All of the sponsors and all of the sponsorships in this were so successful that we're already looking at partnering on further expeditions here in Hong Kong and elsewhere. And I think that's a real check mark for the strength of this team and the strength of this organization. What I would also say, and this is what Paul had mentioned, I'll be covering, is the permissions. Everybody needs permissions or typically I would say we need country permissions when we're going on expeditions. We need permits. We need all this. You can imagine this is a naval plane found in a Hong Kong country park. So we needed a Hong Kong government permission to access the site. But because it's a naval plane and not Air Force, interestingly, Air Force gives up all of its equipment, its downed equipment, after 60 years. It no longer lays any claim. If you're going out to salvage a 60-year-old American aircraft, it's yours. The Navy never does. And this is a crucial point. I believe it's probably due to salvage, underwater salvage, the history of the Navy, et cetera. They never really focus on that, but there's a whole team, a command, for those of you familiar with how the U.S. Navy works, called the National Heritage and Historical Command. And this is the group that's responsible for granting permission for lost Navy artifacts. So we need to work with them. We need to work with Naval Heritage and Historical Command. To dig up the site. And I think dig is a little strong. We really were able to penetrate maybe the topsoil, but we didn't really have permission to go lower. We had to work with 3 layers of Hong Kong museums to ensure the appropriate conservation, storage, presentation of the found artifacts. And this permission from UNHC only came through at the 11th hour, despite close to a year's worth of discussions. I think it was a day or 2 days before we were actually ready to go up. And then what you need to think about, with all the geopolitical tension in the world, we had to work with several governments. We had the Hong Kong, to a certain extent China, and Hong Kong remains an SAR of China, and the US. So working with several bureaucracies, the US Navy, the US Consulate, the Hong Kong Museum System, the Hong Kong Park System, Hong Kong universities, American universities, it was an intense amount of tightrope. And then on top of that, our funding came from US organizations and Asian organizations. So I think our team's really proud of the knife edge that we walked, and the fact we're able to balance all the priorities of these various organizations in order to properly develop the relationships and permissions to execute this project Avenger. And I think what's important is everybody saw it as a very important piece of future, piece of exploration, piece of science that we were doing. So I think what I've mentioned earlier is that we had the experts and the research all came together. My favorite partnership, which you can see here, is the Hong Kong Government Flying Service. We were able to not even contract with them. They volunteered to bring all of our equipment up the mountain, which saved literally tons of carrying equipment up. And then when we found the artifacts, they were able to bring them all down. So as I look at this slide, as I look at this picture, we were able to gold plate our volunteer service up the mountain, have the most luxurious base camp I've ever seen. This was probably one of the highlights of last year, being able to pack this up and send it out. So maybe moving on to the next one, please. And then I think on what we should really look at is volunteers. Archaeology like we did, an expedition like we did, would not be possible without volunteers. We really needed people to record, people to dig, lightly dig. We needed people to set up camp. So we had close to 300 volunteers come up the mountain over 10 days, and they're sourced throughout Hong Kong, included locals, expats, members from the American Club, one of our big sponsors, Boy Scouts, and just the general public, as well as academics. So Paul mentioned this earlier. Project Avenger was and continues to be an opportunity to shed light on what is essentially a forgotten or not well-known era of Hong Kong. Very few Hong Kongers realize at one point, essentially the entire US Pacific Naval Fleet ran a bombing operation on what was a Japanese occupied city. And that's what our goal was. That was, as Paul pointed out, we had many goals, but part of our goal with Project Avenger was to give volunteers and the city a sense of pride, a sense of history, and for people who came up the mountain to participate firsthand and shedding light on this history of the city. So for my part, I'm very, very proud of that. think we'll pass it over now to Michael to talk about fieldwork.
All right, so thank you so much for to the Explorers Club and to the audience listening right now. I'm going to run through sort of like the process of fieldwork that we went through, and I'm very excited to be sharing these because you're one of the first audiences that we are speaking to about what we found since the fieldwork took place. On the left-hand side, you see the do you mind going back just a little bit? Yeah. This is just a map to show you the context of where the site is. And so the left is the most zoomed out one of Hong Kong Island. And then you can actually see closer and closer in the country park itself, where the site is. It's on a hillside and it's about maybe 300 or so meters above sea level. Many people in Hong Kong go here to go hiking, but our site is actually located kind of like off route. And then you can show the video now. Thanks, Paul. And so we're very excited actually in this project. Like from my perspective as a trained archaeologist, to use new technologies in order to investigate even more in more detail was very exciting for me. So to collaborate with Dr. Wallace Lai at Polytechnic University was great because he had some of the latest drone and LiDAR technology, which had allowed us to map out our sites on a 3D terrain map. And so you can see the contours showing the sort of altitude, and on each little red square on this map, on this diagram, is actually a meter by a meter square that was a grid that we set up to do our archaeology in. You'll actually see that our sites are quite a little bit spread out across this hillside. And that's because when we were developing our field logistics or our field method, we knew that we had to keep it flexible enough to accommodate for any time in these archaeological investigations, to accommodate for the discovery of new or unexpected data that would then drive us to think about changing our trajectory about how we're going to do this. And so like from my perspective, I was always thinking about, what is the significance of going to a certain area? Where do we anticipate the location of most of the important data? What are the potential time limitations? Any changes in environmental conditions and our manpower and the time that we have, right? And so we actually have one of our biggest sites, which was the landing site, I think. It's on the top of the hill. And this is kind of like kind of near the top of the hill where we found our crash site. We believe that it sort of just came tumbling down. And then it actually cleared up the vegetation in that area. Like it probably burned up back then. And, even when we first got there, when Craig first got there years ago, the vegetation didn't really grow that much in that area, likely because, 70 something years ago, the plane had crashed there and affected the soil in that area. And over the years, parts of the plane had probably flowed down the river during rainy season every year. And so we actually set up some satellite sites away from the crash site as well. And we came up with just, very simple military names for them: Site Alpha, Site Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo. And whenever we arrived at one of these sites, it was super important to do this very systematically. And so with Craig's help and with our sponsor, Garrett Metal Detectors' help, we did a very thorough survey of the hillside. And this was what allowed us to determine the extent of where all of our metal pieces were under the ground. And we recovered some significant items from the wreckage that way. Every time that we suspected that there would be an interesting site, because the metal detector would beep, we would then we would take photographs as shown here. All the time you can see that we had to have some scaling. So that's what the big archaeological stick is for. You can see on the right-hand photograph, there is some scales and a north sign. And this allows us to find the orientation and the location, and also the sizing, the scale of what we're looking at when we take photographs. Next slide, please. The next step, which took a bit of time. Adam and Paul will know like how much time it took, but to set up these archaeological grid squares, you know, it is really fine work. And I was very proud to see them and to see all the volunteers learn how to do this. We basically set it up in 1 meter by 1 meter. And here are some of the sort of big pieces that we have, the biggest pieces that we have. In the top hand photograph, we have the main crash site. So this is where it would make sense we find the most stuff. In the very far background of that photograph, you might be able to see this kind of thing that sticks out of the ground. We believe that to be the nose of the plane, the propeller that was probably right at the nose of the plane. And on the left, bottom left, is a big metal plate, very thick, very heavy. This was likely near the cockpit or in the cockpit where the pilot was sitting, and this would have protected the airmen from, you know, bullets. And on the right-hand side, now this is a very, very important piece, which we're going to come back to later, but this is actually a piece of fuselage, part of the body of the plane. You can sort of see that there's like this whitish color on the underside of it. That whitish color is what kind of indicates for us that it's like the fuselage or the body of the plane. We're going to come back to this one in a second. So all the volunteers, we asked them to do mapping or schematics of each grid square. And this again was very intricate work, but you know, this is very exciting for me because not many archaeology projects take community members into their work and try to like train them on how to do this well. Frankly, like even when I do schematics, I'm not very artistic and I can't do it. I can't do it that well. So I was very actually happy with some of these diagrams that the volunteers did. Some of them are very talented. And so long as there are measurements and so long as we have photographs, this schematic is already good enough for us professionals to know where each item was recovered from or where we studied them in the first place. Because in each of these grid squares, we had Polytechnic University's help in GPS coordinating where these squares were. So we would always take one of the corners of these squares, and then that would allow us to see that. Another thing that Polytechnic University helped us a lot with was to use some new technology methods to do 3D photogrammetry. And so in this video, you actually see one of our biggest pieces. This is a piece of the landing gear, part of the landing apparatus underneath the plane. This stretches about 2 meters wide. Or 2 meters long, and so we're not going to recover that. It's really way too heavy. We could probably ask the government flying service to take it down the mountain, but you know what? We just thought we would leave it there, and we would take a 3D scan of it. And so this is really, really a detailed 3D model of what that looks like, and this allows us to study it also remotely. We mentioned that we collaborated with 2 American professionals in aviation archaeology. We would send them some of these scans, some of these 3D models, and that allowed us also to have their expertise, have them weigh in day by day on our operations and see if we could get any useful advice from them. Next slide, I think. Okay. Here are some more 3D models. And so these are some more videos that we took. Paul did some of these, and it's actually really cool because like we could just use our like iPhones or iPads to do these. There's some really sophisticated apps these days. So it takes a bit of rendering time, but you know, once it's done, it's right on your phone. And so I have plenty of these 3D scans as well on my phone. And so when I'm out to coffee with a friend, I might like just show off using some of these. But yeah, really exciting to use these 3D methods. Next slide, please. We were also very excited to speak to some schools. Like while we were up there, we also went on the radio once or twice. And so this was like part of our outreach and our public engagement that we did. We really wanted to share the process of fieldwork during that moment. So really, we got up nice and early that morning, I remember, to speak to this school. Craig, Paul, and I, we introduced them to the site. We showed them around live, and I did a bit of digging as well. So this is really cool to do, and I hope to see more of this in the future in other like expeditions and other excavations. Excavation itself was really a very big team effort. Like in this capacity, like I just have to oversee. I have to bounce around different sites. So did Paul and Adam and Craig. Like we were running around all over the place. And so the volunteers really did the heavy lifting on this. They literally, because they would, you know, make sure that the grid squares were good. They would go, you know, brush aside the vegetation very carefully. They would be the ones to use the metal detector and try and identify where there was stuff that was interesting to study. They would bag it. They would note the grid square that it came from and the date that they found it. And it was really exciting to do this, because the volunteers, some of them were up there maybe 5 or 7 times. They became experts in themselves. These, like, you know, 14-year-old kids and 19-year-old university students, they could handle like a section of our excavation all by themselves. So that was really great. Whenever we had stuff, we would take the bags back to our like main operations, our Omega location on our site, and we would take photographs. We would maybe draw some diagrams. This is really important in the recording process, because archaeology is a very destructive process. You know, the best way to preserve historical artifacts is, of course, to leave them alone. but when you excavate them, there are many things that we can do to preserve their appearance when they first come out. And also some of these things we really do hope to exhibit in a museum one day. We are negotiating which museum that might be in Hong Kong, but that is something that we are very excited about. So part of this process after processing is also like, how do we store all the artifacts safely in the right humidity and temperature conditions, and how do we like package that so that the helicopter can help us bring it back down the mountain and put it in a safe location. So this is kind of like the variety of things that we've found. I think some of the most exciting things would be like in the top right corner, we actually had a lamp from our hotel site, found a bit like a couple days, maybe like a week after we started. This is really cool because we could actually see inside this lamp that would have been on the wing of the plane, bits of glass. And so besides metal, we also had like pieces of glass. We had pieces of leather, and we could see like plastic, like what would have wrapped wiring inside the plane. So like for insulation. And the bottom left corner is another plate, which would have been really, really heavy. Again, protecting the pilot in the cockpit. Yeah. Let's go to one of our most important pieces. And so in the top left corner is a model of what our Avenger plane would have looked like. This is a 3D model that Paul found online. And we believe that that piece of fuselage that we showed you earlier is a really important piece, because if you click once, yeah, we actually have this really like distinctive groove, this kind of like U-shaped groove that's in the corner here of this piece. And if you click one more time, we actually have if you click one more time, Paul, yeah, we actually believe that on a plane similar to this one in the photo, this is an Avenger plane, but in all planes where there's an exhaust pipe coming out, we believe that this is what that groove is for. It's for a pipe for the exhaust. This is a very distinctive shape. And if we actually go back to the historical record of what the plane parts look like, we believe that we actually identified that this fuselage piece proves that it is an Avenger Model 1C aircraft, which actually distinguishes it from an Avenger 3, which is very important because in Hong Kong, as mentioned earlier, there were 2 planes that crashed, and there are 2 different models. So that fuselage is really important for proving that it's the 1C. Paul, back to you.
Great. Yeah. No, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. So, well, Michael basically wrapped it up in the end, said like, look, with these find, in particular of that specific piece of fuselage, we basically think we have enough scientific evidence to exactly point out, based on the aircraft action report of the day, which is here on this slide, that the plane that we found is the Buno number 46438, which then basically allows us to pinpoint what exact aircraft that is. And as it comes, we found even a photo of that aircraft that was just taken, I think, a few days before. You see that here in the foreground, the airplane with the 124 a number on the tail. That's the airplane that we basically located. And with that, we could then dig further and basically go down and pinpoint who was the crew and the story of that. And maybe, Craig, you can share for 2 minutes quickly what the background story is, and also your efforts to basically connect with the relatives.
Yes, thanks, Paul. As Paul said at the very beginning, one of our main objectives was to actually try to put a number to the plane that we were at. I mean, we were looking extensively throughout all the American documents, and nowhere in their records do they say that any plane landed in this location. So it was a complete unknown officially. So what we wanted to try and do is basically put some faces and names to it. So by using the aircraft action reports there that we've been talking to about, and you can see an example of there, we actually found the crew list of the 2 planes that collided. Now, each of these planes held 3 crew. They had a pilot, they had a top gunner, and then they had a navigator bomber. So between these 2 planes that collided, we actually have a potential of 6 crewmen. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to try and give some sort of closure to the family, because as far as they knew, from what we can tell, there's no official report of where these people died. They just don't know. So what I did manage to do is try to individually go through each one of those names of those 6 crew to try to find if I could find any information. And what was really amazing was where this actually really came together, and I'm mindful of time here, so I'll try to speed up a little bit here, is that the prisoner of war diary accounts that I told you earlier on there, they clearly said that 2 planes collided. And when we get these action reports and you see 16, 17 aircrafts all got shot down, but 2 of them collided, then you know that you've got these 2 planes here. So I then had a list of 6 crew members, and I didn't know which plane it was around, but then again, this was what was going to help us identify which plane was which. And I was researching and I was researching. I couldn't find anything. And then one day, it was Christmas. It was a Christmas, and I got a brand new book, and it was a book about the US submarine operations just outside Tokyo Bay towards the end of the war. And completely unrelated, but this submarine boat, the Tang, it got sunk outside Tokyo Bay, or Yokohama Bay, I think it was. The crew members all got taken to a prisoner of war camp, which was also shared by airmen. It was like a specialist camp. And in there is an account of them, the submarine who this whole story is, the story's about. He said a lieutenant, junior grade from the US Navy, got dragged in from Hong Kong in a wheelbarrow, and he shared this story, and it is exactly the same person. So this coincidence that I was reading a story about submarines in Japan actually brought up the very name of the pilot that I was actually searching for in Hong Kong. I mean, my jaw absolutely hit the ground. I could not believe it. So I actually reached out to the author, who the name eludes me just now, but he was very kind, and he actually forwarded me the original transcripts that were post-war that the prisoner of wars did for intelligence about the guards and everything else. So I then managed to get a huge amount of information about this pilot and the rest of the crew, which then gives us closure for to the family, because now we've got pictures. We can now say that this crew was in this airplane site. The other crash site had the other 3 crew, and we were able to try to identify them. So I then set about trying to do a bit of research there on, Ancestry and family.com and all the rest of it. And very quickly, I actually managed to find one family member, and it wasn't actually it was not the pilot that you see there in the picture there, that very handsome chap there, all very nicely done, but it was actually the gunner. And I just want to share a very brief story about this gunner as well, because again, it's all about the human aspect rather than just the machinery, rusting in the hillside. Yes, we have that the pilot there who was he was taken to POW camp Afuna in Japan. He died a few weeks later from septicemia and basically lack of care. He was very badly burnt from head to toe, 3rd degree, and he basically was delusional from the minute he got there. So the guy that you see up there, Richard Hunt there, the pilot, he didn't have a good time of it for the last few weeks of his existence. However, the other story that I would like to share with you with the other crew member was actually his gunner. Now, what actually happened was the day before, they were on a mission to Taiwan, and his wingman, who happened to be the other guy in the collision, Scoble, his wingman developed engine trouble on the way to Taiwan. So they both turned around and came back. What happened was the gunner the gunner in our airplane actually was injured a day or two beforehand on a flight over Vietnam. Actually, it was. So they had a substitute, a stand-in gunner that wasn't normally part of the crew. I think it was his second day or second or third sortie or mission with this crew, and he actually crashed as a stand-in temporary one. But I think what really got me was when I was reading this, it was the guy's 20th birthday. He died on his 20th birthday, standing in for a crew that he didn't really know. He was just doing a one-off job. He should have been out of that. He shouldn't have really been sort of assigned to that boat anyway, or that ship anyway. And, you know, on his 20th birthday, he gets shot down over Hong Kong. And that big dome that you kept seeing there, the armor plating there, his feet would have been tucked up right behind that on impact. So finding that there and knowing what the story about really kind of put a little bit of a choke in the back of your throat there, just because you're starting to put names and faces to stories. And I have reached out to family members, and I am in contact with them in the US. So it's been really rewarding, especially when we were up on for Thanksgiving Day. On one of the days of the project, it was actually Thanksgiving, and we just had a moment as a sign of respect, and I had a few words, and it was very moving, which I could then send the video of the service to the family members back in the US. So that was probably one of the highlights of the trip for me as well. So, Paul, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, well, thank you, Greg, and thanks for sharing, particularly the human element in the story, that basically all these findings allowed us basically to pinpoint and basically lift the numerous layers of this project. And I think that, I mean, I'm very mindful of time. We have, obviously, as probably viewers can see, we are very passionate about this project that has obviously accompanied us for a long time. We didn't even mention, we're very happy and proud to carry flag number 211 of the Explorers Club on this mission. So I think we are now in the final phase of wrapping this up. Michael has already alluded, we are working with a local museum to basically conserve some of the artifacts, hopefully, and basically bring them to the local audience, or basically have a permanent exhibition that will honor or share the stories of these aerial attacks. Parallel to that, several scientific articles are in preparation that basically will share the findings of this expedition. With that, I see that we have a few questions that basically have come in. So I will just quickly see if we can have a look.
I can field them. Do you mind if I field them?
Sorry?
I can read them.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. One of the first questions here is, could we tell them a bit more about the photo scanning applications on our phones to create those renderings? Do we have any recommended apps? What tools are we using to measure those? So we had the most success with an app called Polycam, which I think we paid for a subscription for more sophisticated settings. So maybe folks can experiment with that. Another one, if you just search on the App Store, is 3D Scanner app. So Polycam or 3D Scanner app. So be sure to use some, when you're doing this, be sure to use some black and white squares printed out perhaps. And this will clearly identify the scale and the orientation for the device when you're taking lots of photographs of an item. I'll field another question, and then I'll field the last one to one of you guys. One of the other questions was, could you tell us more about the local reaction in Hong Kong? And I would say we actually had several members of press come up, and we were reported both in English and Cantonese or Chinese news outlets. And so most of the public were really happy with that. A lot of people were very excited to maybe even try and find the site afterwards as well. And so we didn't have too many surprise visitors during our field work. And so most of the local community here were very excited about it. We worked with maybe almost 3 or 4 different government offices as well. In order to do this, we had to get permissions, for example, from the Agriculture, Fisheries and Conservation, AFCD department, because it's in a country park. And so we worked with many different authorities. They let us through, and we told them what we found, and all of them sort of responded with a lot of interest. A question for one of you guys. I've been exploring a mystery World War II hell diver underwater. Did you find the unique ID plates of the Hong Kong planes?
I could probably say a bit about that. Short answer is no, unfortunately not. But what we did do is we reached out to a couple of curators and mechanics that were working on these this exact machine that have the maintenance list. And they were able to send us a couple of photographs to tell us, I think there were meant to be three different locations. There were slight variations between either if it was a Grumman's made or if it was General Motors work, but they were generally in the same kind of location. One up near the engine hub, one close down to the pilot's yoke, I believe it was, or sort of power unit. And I think there was another one lower down towards sort of like the navigator and stuff. So we were looking high and low for that. We know that that would have been the actual holy grail. If we would have found that on day one, we could have almost packed up the whole expedition because that's what we were looking for. However, no, we didn't find that, but we always thought that that was going to be a massive needle in the haystack, particularly because I don't want to jump the gun or anything, really reveal any information before the papers out. But we suspect that it was actually a very high angle a crash, that everything was condensed fairly close. So we did a really good scour around and we couldn't find anything. So I suspect that it was probably burnt and just melted in the explosion in the aftermath of the crash.
Could you tell us more on the timeline of exhibiting what you found and if there are more opportunities for other members to contribute in future fieldwork?
Jiman, can you share maybe a little bit on this? on the way of basically what the timeline is in terms of like what we think for exhibiting and sharing some of the findings of the expedition?
I don't think we have a very concrete timeline because we are still trying to work out with the local museums and so on. So it's a bit complicated, let's put it this way. But because all the museums in Hong Kong, or government museums, most of them are now under renovation, and some of them, well, do have some ideas about exhibiting some of the items, but no concrete plan has been drafted yet. And because of the situation, COVID and so on, so everything are more like in flux in Hong Kong nowadays. So long-term planning is not really very concrete. Just like our project, we dragged it on for 3 years, and so yeah, expect more bureaucracy from Hong Kong. Let's put it this way. Yeah. Well,
apologies for putting you on the spot. Now, it's definitely. I think the answer to the question is that we are very much working on this happening. I firmly believe that it will eventually happening, but I think it just needs to go through the appropriate, especially given the overall climate and some sensitivity that's obviously surrounding these issues. It needs to go the appropriate channels, and hence that's why it's important for us in the meantime to obviously work on appropriate conservation and work on publishing the results and doing the main promotion or some sharing of this historical chapter through channels like here, or obviously also work through talks, etc. Locally, where, as Michael alluded to already, the reception was very positive.
Sorry, Paul, I have something to add though. I forgot to mention that a few days ago, one of the new MTR stations, underground mass transit system in Hong Kong, exhibited one of the 1,000-pound US bomb found near Wan Chai seabed during the war. So I think we can be slightly optimistic in the prospect of exhibiting these items in the public, because the MTR, one of the the government had the major share of that company, decided to publicly show this item. So this can be a very good predecessor for us. I don't know why they decided to do it, but it seems that no negative feedbacks from different corners. So it seems that everything suddenly turns into a more optimistic direction. Yeah.
That's great. Point out that's Paul. I just jump in there too as well, and point out that that's why we spent so much time making sure that we had the right permissions ahead of time. We engaged the right stakeholders. We engaged the community, because this isn't as I keep saying, this wasn't for kind of 8 people to go up the hill and have a 10-day great time. This is really a project for the community. We expect to see it continue to shed light. We expect to continue to have these kind of engagements, but without having done that work at the beginning, people would have been less committed to making sure that the story continues to be shown.
Absolutely. I think there is, if I see there's 2 more questions. One is if we have worked on with any aviation experts and the historians on the plane itself to learn more about the plane and discover the cause of the crash. I think basically, yes, historians. We have Dr. Chi-Man Kwong here, who is the expert on this chapter of World War II history in Hong Kong, their history. And then, of course, as Adam outlined in the team, bringing aviation expertise onto the project was one of the key factors. In fact, actually, the aviation archaeological expertise was one of the factors that took us so long to pull the whole project together, as we couldn't get these experts into Hong Kong, and hence had to re-engineer the process, where we basically said, like, well, none of the experts in aviation that are based in the US, that are experts on the potential plane, nobody wants to sit through 3 weeks of very restrictive hotel quarantine. So this is not going to happen. We cannot put the Project Avenger on until basically COVID has passed, but that's probably, who knows when that's going to happen. And that's when this idea came, that we basically moved to a process of virtual fieldwork, where basically an expert like Michael would work on the ground, and he would basically run the fieldwork in a scientific manner, and then we would share in a virtual way, the same way we can communicate these days, everything over Zoom, create a virtual workspace where the experts in the US, Adam and Bill, can log in daily, check with us the items that we have found, analyze them, and basically, yes, they cannot touch them physically because they're in the US, while we're obviously operating in Hong Kong, but they can be almost as present these days and busy guiding us. And that's eventually how we also identified it. And that's also why we think that this could be a unique blueprint for a future endeavors. And I think then that is...
It's important to note, maybe Paul, I could jump in again, with this, everything that Paul said is 100% correct. And we are looking to publish several articles, both internally here in Hong Kong, as well as internationally peer-reviewed scientific archaeological journals. And with that, we need to make sure that we have the right expertise. And that this is, I think I mentioned it before, this wasn't just a bunch of people going up the hill. This is a proper archaeological dig, and we've brought in the proper archaeological experts, historian experts. The team was diverse, credentialed, and as such, this is, as Paul mentioned, the blueprint is the right way of looking at this. This was a true archaeological dig. Just because our aviation experts were in the US doesn't mean they were any less hands-on.
Groundbreaking in many respects.
Yeah. And then I think there's a perfect questions to wrap it up. We get a question, would be great if we basically could share a little bit what's coming up next. What's the next project? And I know there's obviously things are, obviously this wasn't the last stone. We already said this is a blueprint for future endeavors. And we think we obviously can use the way of collaboration of community and technology to obviously apply to new projects. Adam, you want to share already a little bit on
absolutely love to. Listen, and this, I think, for any of you who aren't Explorers Club members, especially here in Hong Kong, you should reach out to us. We are very inclusive, and we're trying to bring in the community, because that's how we can, in many ways, can justify these expeditions. We have 2 underwater wrecks that we think we have identified. We need to do something similar. They're actually both boats. Ships, so we may need some extra help in field work there, and that will be very similar to what we've done with a plane on the mountain, ships in the water. So we're working the details out on those, and then we're working very closely with some stakeholders, many many world-class stakeholders here in Hong Kong around reseeding oyster beds. And that is something that we're really excited because for those of you who don't know, Hong Kong used to have a massive oyster population that protected itself against typhoons, and that was depleted by basically cement work. So there's a lot of exciting things going on. Please reach out to the group. We should have some fieldwork opportunities, and we're always looking for members who are interested in exploration and expeditions. So the Explorers Club is a very long history of doing really interesting things. We're inclusive, we're diverse, and we'd love to have you as part of future expeditions.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, and obviously, I just want to add to that. We have these exciting projects in Hong Kong coming up, but we're obviously hoping to export also this blueprint also further. I mentioned I'm now based out of Portugal. I'm hoping to build out the local chapter, and I'm also now already starting to be involved in some very, very exciting projects across the globe. There's one in particular interesting project in Greenland. That's a search for also a World War II airplane. So in case anybody here is on the phone wants to learn more, as you can probably see between the group here, we probably can spin ideas for another hour. But if any one of you is interested, please reach out and get in touch with us, and we would love to include and come up with opportunities. And with that, I think I just want to wrap it up. As you can see, a passionate team here on a unique mission. We shed some light on a unique part of history. We had a big community and hopefully educated some future explorers. I know for a fact that there's quite a few Boy Scouts in Hong Kong now out there that are very excited about digging out airplanes and want to become explorers when they're grown up. And also the way we hopefully introduced a new way of field work that's not just applicable under COVID restrictions, but hopefully allows us to go into the field, maybe in smaller teams, and reach more targets. So I hope it was interesting. Thank you very much. And please reach out to us and be in touch. Thank you.